d4. In the opening, it is advantageous to occupy the center with a pawn and to develop the pieces with a view to controlling the center. White begins by placing a pawn where it takes complete possession of one important square and attacks two others. Control of the two squares e5 and c5 makes it impossible for black to place pieces there. White can hope to use e5 and c5 as outposts for his pieces, which will have the support of the d-pawn. The advance of the d-pawn serves an additional purpose in opening lines for white's queen and c1 bishop. d5. This is the simplest way for black to get an equal grip on the center and to prevent white acquiring more territory with e4. c4. White offers a pawn to divert black's d-pawn from the center. In effect, it is an offer to exchange a flank pawn for a center pawn, as white can regain the pawn without any trouble. Concealed in white's proposal is a threat of destroying black's pawn center by c takes d5, queen takes d5, knight c3. Gaining a tempo, as white develops a piece while black must move the same one again. Queen a5, e4, and white's control of the center is imposing. e6. Black defends the center by supporting the d-pawn with another pawn. If white plays c takes d5, black can recapture with a pawn and maintain a pawn in the center. Black does not capture white's c4 pawn, as that means surrendering the center and his grip on e4. The shutting in of his c8 bishop, after e6, and the consequent difficulty in developing that piece effectively is one of the reasons for the popularity of the Queen's Gambit, for white. Knight c3. A good move, as the knight attacks the two central squares e4 and d5, adding its influence to the pawn's pressure on the latter. Knight f6. Black's knight develops toward the center, where its mobility is greatest and where it can counter the pressure exerted by white's knight. Bishop g5. A pin which threatens c takes d5, e takes d5, bishop takes f6, when black must either submit to being left with a badly doubled pawn by g takes f6, or lose a pawn after queen takes f6, knight takes d5. The threat is actually of minor importance. White's real aim in pinning the knight is not to institute a threat that can so easily be parried. What white is interested in is the most effective placement of his pieces, and the development of the bishop at g5 is extremely strong. The restraint it places on black's knight and the cramping effect it has on black's whole game is not easily shaken off. Knight bd7. In queen's pawn openings, black's queen's knight does its best job at d7, not c6. At d7 it supports the other knight and helps prepare the advance of the c-pawn to c5. The b8 knight must not move to c6, where it obstructs the c-pawn. The c-pawn must be free to advance and attack white's center. Black incidentally sets a trap with the text move, which is designed to catch the greedy player. e3. Why not win a pawn by c takes d5, e takes d5, knight takes d5 instead? There would then follow knight takes d5, the knight breaks the pin by brute force, bishop takes d8, bishop b4, check, queen d2, bishop takes d2, check, king takes d2, king takes d8, and black has gained a piece. White could not fall into the trap if he followed the principle which covers these cases: do not chase after pawns at the expense of your development. White's last move supports the central d4 pawn and creates an outlet for the f1 bishop. c6. Black strengthens his d-pawn and opens a diagonal for his queen's use. He plans a counterattack beginning with queen a5 and bishop b4. a3. This puts a stop to any such maneuver, as black's bishop can never get to b4 to pin the knight. Bishop e7. Black develops a piece, unpins the knight and clears the back rank for castling. Queen c2. An ideal development for the queen in this opening. At c2, the queen exerts pressure on the c-file, which will be strongly evident after center pawns are exchanged, and controls the e4 square. The latter circumstance is the reason for the queen coming into play at this point, instead of the expected mobilization of the kingside pieces. It is vital to guard the e4 square so that black cannot free himself easily by playing knight e4 and exchanging some pieces. Castle kingside. Black moves his king to safer quarters. He cannot free his crowded position by the Lasker maneuver knight e4 as white responds bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, knight takes e4, d takes e4, queen takes e4 and wins a pawn. Notice that white's pawn at a3 prevents black from regaining the pawn by queen b4, check, showing that white's sixth move was not a waste of time. Instead of the passive kingside castling, black should have tried for counterplay by d takes c4, bishop takes c4, e5, which disputes control of the center and helps clear a diagonal for his c8 bishop. Knight f3. White brings his king's knight to its best post and attacks the e5 square again, putting an end to any contemplated break by e5. a6. Preparation for the maneuver d takes c4, bishop takes c4, b5, bishop d3, bishop b7, followed by an eventual c5. This would serve to develop the c8 bishop, free his queenside and start action against white's pawn center. Rook d1. If black is going in for an attack on the wing, white is prepared to meet it with the recommended antidote, play in the center. The position of the rook at d1 acts as a deterrent to central pawn exchanges by black, as any clearances on the d-file increase the pressure of the rook on that file. Rook e8. Black brings his rook to the e-file, as the center is usually the theater of action. Bishop d3. With the entrance of this bishop, white's development is nearly complete. Notice that he plays no combinations of any sort, either to win material or to start an attack on the king, until most of his pieces are brought off the back rank and into play. It is only after these pieces are posted where they are most effective, where they control the center, enjoy their greatest mobility, and take possession of a good part of the important territory, that white looks around for a combination, a stroke that will decide the game quickly. D takes c4. Black has delayed taking this pawn until white's f1 bishop made a move, so that the bishop will now lose a move in recapturing. Bishop takes c4. The recapture is forced. b5. Black makes the bishop lose time in retreating and vacates the b7 square, ready for the development of the c8 bishop. Bishop d3. From this square, the bishop manages to be remarkably useful. It reaches out in two directions to attack, it helps guard e4 from invasion, it threatens black's kingside and, by attacking h7, prevents black from freeing himself by means of c5. h6. If c5, then d takes c5, bishop takes c5, bishop takes h7, check and white wins a pawn, as the pinned knight is helpless to take the bishop. Certainly not knight takes c5, bishop takes h7, check and white wins the queen by discovered attack. With the text move, black moves the h-pawn out of the attack of white's queen and bishop. Now he hopes to free his queenside and establish a state of tension in the center by c5. Incidentally, he would like white's g5 bishop to declare its intentions. Bishop takes f6. A very fine concept. White does not waste time holding on to the two bishops but plays to prevent any counterplay by c5. If he can keep the c-pawn from advancing, black's game will be fearfully cramped, and he may never solve the problem of getting his light-squared bishop settled on a decent square. The immediate object of bishop takes f6 is to divert one of black's recapturing pieces, the knight or the bishop, from its surveillance of the c5 square and the support of a pawn moving to that square. Knight takes f6. This is probably better than taking with the bishop, as black's queen and c8 bishop now have more freedom. Castle kingside. The king, who must be secure from danger at all costs, goes into hiding, while the rook, that must take part in the fighting, comes closer to the scene of action. Bishop b7. With rook and queen on the same file, it would be foolhardy to venture on c5. White simply takes the pawn, d takes c5, and punishes the recapture bishop takes c5 with bishop h7, check, winning the queen. Black's idea, besides that of developing the light-squared bishop, is to bring his rook to c8 and then push the c-pawn. Knight e4. White clears the c-file so that he now has three pieces, queen, knight and d4, pawn, concentrating their power on c5, with the aim of making an advance of black's c-pawn to that square impossible. Notice too how white has resisted the temptation to play e4, filling up the center with pawns. Instead he keeps the e4 square free and utilizes it as a springboard for his pieces. Knight takes e4. Otherwise, white might swing the knight over to c5 and completely smother black's queenside. Bishop takes e4. Still keeping black under restraint, he may not play c5 as his b7 bishop would be snapped up. f5. Black must drive the bishop off at once, even at the cost of weakening the pawn position on his kingside. A delay gives white time to play knight e5, intensifying the pressure on the c-pawn and incidentally providing the f3 square for a bishop retreat, followed if need be by rook c1. Bishop d3. The third visit of the bishop to this square. White must not be hasty and play bishop takes c6 as the reply rook c8 pins the bishop. Queen b6. Once again preparing the liberating pawn push. Rook c1. The position demands that white devote all his efforts to sustaining the blockade of black's c-pawn. White must acquire undisputed control of the c5 square, so that the pawn may never advance. He must not relax for a moment, as domination of the key c5 square virtually assures him of a positional win. Rook a c8. Black persists in his plan to push the pawn. If he does not get this move in, his b7 bishop will never have any heir. b4. White nails the pawn down. White has a won game, strategically. What remains is to apply the proper tactical touches to compel the opponent to yield. The time is ripe for the combinations to appear. Queen d8. Ready to parry queen b3 with queen d5. Knight e5. A powerful blow. White attacks the unfortunate c-pawn, which must stay where it is, a third time. Against passive resistance, white plans f4, to give his knight additional support and to stabilize the center, followed by bishop e2 and bishop f3, after which the c-pawn must perish. a5. Black attacks one of the pawns hemming in his queenside. Against bishop f6 white sticks to the script with f4, followed by bishop e2 and bishop f3. Queen b3. Again threatening queen takes e6, check, or bishop takes f5. White probably gave no more than a glance to b takes a5, to which black can reply queen takes a5, bishop takes a3 or c5, any of which gives him far too much freedom, from white's point of view. Bishop d6. The defense that black had relied on is ruled out. If queen d5, then queen takes d5 and white wins a pawn after e takes d5, bishop takes f5. Or c takes d5, bishop takes b5. Bishop takes f5. The first bit of actual violence brings in a pawn. Queen f6. With an attack on the bishop and a double attack on the knight, black hopes to get his pawn back. Bishop b1. The idea of this withdrawal to the back rank is to support the queen in an attack along a diagonal, either by moving the queen to c2 or by shifting the bishop to a2 behind the queen. Bishop takes e5. Black does not care to part with the services of an active piece, but he must do so in order to recover the pawn he lost. D takes e5. Forced. Queen takes e5. Material is even, and black seems to have survived the worst. It is true that white can win a pawn by b takes a5, but he would be left with doubled and isolated pawns on the a-file, and it is doubtful that he could get any advantage from the extra pawn. There must be a better reward for fine positional play than this dubious bounty. Rook c5. White spurns the pawn, in favor of piling on more pressure. The rook now holds black's queenside in a paralyzing grip. The strength of white's move is evident in the fact that the rook can never be dislodged. a4. An intermediary move, whose purpose is not only to save the pawn, but also to gauge white's plans by his next queen move. Queen a2. A remarkable retreat. One would expect queen c2 so that the queen, backed up by the bishop, might penetrate black's kingside position. However, black refutes this cleverly by queen f6, and now, queen h7, check, is met by king f7, when white has no means of furthering the attack. 2. e4, intending to banish the queen by e5 and then pierce the position, e5 and black repels any invasion. Queen d6. The defense queen f6 succumbs to e4, now we see the point of queen a2, it is to pin black's e-pawn and prevent e5 at this point, rook cd8, e5, queen f4, queen c2, threatening queen h7, check, king f8, bishop g6, rook e7, queen h8, checkmate. Queen g5, f4, queen g4, rook c3, when the entrance of the rook at g3, followed by queen h7, check, is conclusive. Notice that the move rook c3, relaxing the pressure on the queenside, is not an infraction of principle. An attack that leads to a forced win takes precedence over positional considerations. Queen c2. Now this grouping has more effect. White threatens queen h7, check, king f8, bishop g6, rook e8, queen h8, check, king e7, queen takes g7, checkmate. Rook cd8. If e5 to guard the g6 square with the queen, then queen h7, check, king f7, f4, e4, bishop a2, check, king f6, queen f5, check, king e7, queen f7, check, and white wins the bishop, as a start. Queen h7, check. Control of the light squares leading to black's king renders this a decisive invasion. The cramping of black's queenside and the smothering of his bishop make it difficult for black to hold out. King f8. On king f7 white can either win the exchange by a bishop check or pursue the attack by f4, when the continuation might be rook h8, queen g6, check, king f8, f5, e5, f6 and white wins. Bishop g6. Further confines the king while attacking the rook. The threat is queen h8, check, king e7, queen takes g7, checkmate. Black can only delay the execution at great cost in material. White's play is a fine example of the value of preventive strategy. In paralyzing Black's queenside, he demonstrates the extraordinary fact that weaknesses on one wing can lead to complete collapse on the other. Once Black is held in restraint, his efforts to make some sort of stand seem little more than feeble flutterings.